a break, a vacation, we are back. This time it is myself, Bray, and Michael for this episode to discuss transhumanism. Is our fate transhumanism? Is it the fate of humankind, of mankind, to become transhuman, to become trans? Yes.
Yes.
With these two hosts, I'm really glad to get into this topic. I've been thinking about it for kind of a long time. I've been gone for a little while, focusing on some school stuff, so that's out of the way. And we've all been kind of roasting on this for a little bit. I had to do a fair bit of research on transhumanism for something unrelated to the podcast for a couple weeks. So I have a fair bit of material on the top of my brain to kind of bring up as we get into this. But before we get started, good morning. Good to see both of y'all.
Good morning.
Bray,
Morning.
how are you feeling right now? First off, how are you doing? And
I'm
then after
doing
that,
all right.
how do you engage with this topic? What do you think? Is our fate transhumanism?
Sure. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. I am doing fairly well this morning. It's the first day of December in the year of our Lord 2024. And very much looking forward to continuing the holiday celebrations. But as far as transhumanism is concerned, this is a topic that dwells a lot around sort of my general, interest areas. I actually have been, so this is a book that I've been sort of perusing around a little bit. This is in Catherine Hale's How We Became Posthuman. And this is actually, I think it was published in 1999, so it's fairly outdated, especially considering more recent developments and things like artificial intelligence and sort of different, areas of IoT and deep learning and all that stuff. Obviously, developments with like Neuralink and things. But that aside, I've never really spoken about transhumanism particularly at length, but I think it's. I feel like the longer we go in the 21st century, the more relevant it'll become, like a lot of other things. So I'm kind of excited to see where we go today. Wish Stefan could be here, but I guess he's just not. Or if we could have Tanner, who would just adamantly refuse any
everything
sort of
while wearing a pair of sunglasses, going just no. Very good. Michael, I'm curious how you feel about this, and if you can give us a definition of what transhumanism even is. I think we should probably do that.
Sure.
I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, so an armchair definition of transhumanism. Transhumanism is the idea that through technology generally of some sort, we as a species continue our evolution, but in a way that is very intentional. Yeah.
That's
usually that's associated with like body modification or even like neural modification or even body swapping or anything to do with bypassing genetics for the individual. Although thinking about it in the moment, you could also take this in a collective direction with how people think and how people think in concert when thought is so close to thought via like internet connections.
I really like the way, internet connections. Oh my God, I like this topic. I don't mean to interrupt if you have somewhere you're going with that, but it reminded me of something.
No, you're fine.
Oh, well, I wanted to talk about, you ever notice like science fiction, specifically through movies, sure, television, of course, but also like video games where you see people explore scientific ideas or possibilities a little bit and kind of thresh out potential avenues of the future. Specifically in context of this, I'm really reminded of the Kala from StarCraft 2. When I was a kid, I used to play StarCraft religiously. It was my entire personality. And it was just what I did. My dad raised me on all those kind of things. And and in that game, there's this idea from this one faction in there called the Protoss, these aliens, where they have this, they have long dreadlocks, and basically via length of time, they used to be very warlike. They're very similar to the Vulcans from Star Trek, if anyone's familiar with that. I really wish Stefan was here because he would fucking get that. But they used to be very warlike until one day they decided to build this thing called the Kala, which is this like neural link that connects out of the end of their dreadlocks, and essentially it makes all of them hyper aware of each other's emotions. It's not a hive consciousness. It's not like they all share one mind, but they're all hyper aware of and aware of the thinking of the people that they're joined to. So essentially, it reduces the ability for miscommunication and raises forcibly empathy between beings within their space. So in this, so in an age of meaninglessness, you kind of can see the meaning within others. And you know, I saw that and I'm like, God damn, that feels like that could actually happen. You know, that feels something that approaches transhumanism or like a facet of where this could go, an avenue. And you have to take a note here when we get into this whole point about transhumanism. It means a lot of things to a lot of people. What's really crazy about it is it really could become any of these things. There are a lot of open doors available as to where this trajectory could go down. It's a bit like talking about jailbreaking your iPhone, except it's your mind or your consciousness. It's all right. Well, how exactly would that go about? Is it fate that it goes about a certain way? Is it just as it matters, you know, as it just so happens, just like Ford created this particular type of car that everybody drove for a while? Could it just be one particular type avenue of transhumanism that somebody has in mind that we implicate? Or is it that it's fate that we implicate one particular thing because it couldn't have been any other way? Or maybe ontologically speaking, it is always the latter. I don't know. But it is a very interesting topic to go down. And talking about transhumanism, and the reason why I wanted to talk about it is some of the research happening right now, like in neuroscience research. Everybody knows about Neuralink, or at least a lot of people know about Neuralink. But there's also, which just to touch on it a little bit, is an invasive technique where you essentially install something into the side of the head and allows for a communication or an encoding and a decoding of information. I'm not sure if you can encode information with it, but you can decode information out of it and use it to interact with and engage with things. But there's also non-invasive techniques where people are using other technologies to just read brainwaves from the exterior, which is much easier to do and also much less frightening. It's a bit like comparing contacts to LASIK. And people are much more happy to try out LASIK than they are, or contacts than they are LASIK, and using non-invasive techniques to decode information out of the brain and do things with it. Of course, more fuzzy. And it's really interesting when we get into this, the sheer avenues that are available to us. So I wanted just for a moment to ask Bray specifically to see exactly what kind of avenues you have in mind in regards to transhumanism. And if and these avenues that you have in mind, is this where you think it'll go? Or do you just want to open up the table and show us potential roads?
So sure. One thing I think that's critical to the discussion about transhumanism is what the fundamental underlying issue is that prompts a desire for transhumanism, and that's our evolutionary biology. Like the whole crux of the situation is that a transhumanist might consider our fleshy bodies to be inadequate for the direction that we're headed. And now we need to find a way to transcend that. Like what's that quote from The Moment I Understood the Weakness of My Flesh?
It's like a Warhammer. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, it is.
But bad news about the mechanical.
Yeah.
Yeah. You find your problems stay the same there.
Right. So it's about information and how information is stored and transferred and things like that. Like you could easily say that a human being is an embodiment of information by virtue of our like DNA and our genome and things like that, just as anything is, especially something that's living. And so it becomes a discussion about, well, if that's just information and it's stored in this particular way, can we store it and transfer it and manipulate it in another way that still retains some, even a semblance of how it existed prior. And so that's part of, that's like breaking it down to little tiny bits. But as far as where transhumanism could go, maybe let's consider like a very on the horizon avenue. I think I was thinking about this the other day. I encourage everybody to do this, by the way, because it really is frightening to me, but I can only be so upset by it because it has been so pervasive in our culture, and that's just the amount of time that your average person spends staring down at their cell phone. And almost everybody who owns one is guilty of it from one time or another. Like, I've watched people in my life go from having flip phones or little, dumb phones, so to speak, to a point where they have a smartphone. And I've watched them like previously be critical of like people hooked on their smartphones, and then they get one and now they are part of the, the status quo of staring at these. And I think about, like I like to talk about cyberpunk a lot, and people will carry around these things called cyber decks, which are basically small portable computers. And I'm like, man, that'd be so cool if people actually did that. And then I'm like, well, people are fucking doing that all the
Yeah, I'm about to
time.
say,
Like
like,
everybody has one.
Also, people do make cyber decks. They just
Yes,
happen to
and
be
they are awesome. So go please check out the
they're just
cyber deck
huge nerds.
subreddit.
Yeah.
But my point that I'm trying to get to is that I think about how will that change next? How will this action right here of me staring down at this for a prolonged period of time change next? And one of the most popular ideas that people have are like optical implants, or some sort of like, HUD that's only visible to you, that you can manipulate within your vision, that removes a peripheral device in your hands, or something of that nature. It's kind of like, I don't see people wearing, they try and they try and they try with these AR like glasses and things like that, and maybe those will go somewhere, but then it's just another peripheral device to obscure your something on your body. That's, is everybody going to go around wearing glasses? I would be surprised if that's
you could
the
ask
case.
Google Glass on that one.
But yeah,
didn't.
we'll see how that turns out. But I think it'll start, as transhumanism starts with a lot of things, and arguably, like, part of the point of this book is that we may already be at a point in which we are post-human or transhuman with respect to things just like this, just like the cell phone, or any number of tools that enhance our capabilities.
That reminds me, I've heard this argument before. I've heard the argument. It's dependent upon identity, and where do you identify where someone is. But some people consider you already, Bray, in this particular instance, listeners, you listen to this, to be a cyborg in a sense,
right?
Or capable in this way.
Let's do. Can we do like a brief definitions thing here with cybernetics and then cyborg, maybe?
Oh, sure. So in this sense, where I'm trying to go with the word cyborg is essentially a cyborg is a thing which is made up of both organic human parts, and as well as some sort of extension that isn't if you had existed in a space. That's actually quite difficult. I can kind of see, like, I can kind of feather around and kind of touch on. So here's like the basic idea of what a cyborg is. This idea that you have a person, like an organic humanoid, and then like some extension beyond them that is artificial, that makes up the total identity. So like Bray, for example. Bray is not a cyborg insofar as I look at and behold this Bray right here as just that is Bray. Then everything else is other things that Bray is holding in his hand or makes up his person. But I could also consider Bray a cyborg if I look at Bray and behold Bray as both the organic thing, but also the phone in his pocket. That, in a sense, is a cyborg that makes up both Bray and the phone in his pocket. Because, in a sense, Bray is perfectly and totally aware of the exact distance between the Earth and the Moon right now. It just takes him a couple seconds before he can render the information to us. There's a slight delay. And from that perspective, it's really quite interesting because people argue that you're already a cyborg, and all that would happen if I were to give you a brain-computer interface. They call them BCIs. If I were to give you a better brain-computer interface, because you currently already have one, if I were to give you a much faster one, it's essentially the same thing, just a much quicker reception. So instead of having to reach into your pocket, open up your phone, click over to ChatGPT or Google or whatever service you decide to use, and search something, and then have a desired output. It just all happens much faster inside of your brain, and that's
Ding, ding, ding.
essentially the cyborg argument. And it's a little difficult though to define cyborg sometimes, because it really depends on what you what would be the word. It's really quite difficult to define cyborg sometimes, because sometimes to some people a cyborg is someone that would be incomplete without that something added. For example, like I am a cyborg because I have a robot leg. Like that makes up my person. I can't be a person without my leg. But sometimes you could also argue, well, speaking of need, like I really need a co-pilot coding assistant to do my work efficiently at my job. So I mean, I suppose in a sense that makes me a cyborg. Like I'm reliant upon this thing in order to be my person, in order to exist in as my insert job title, let's say. So it's a bit wet definition of a cyborg. It really, I suppose it really comes down just to identity. When I behold Bray, what do I behold him as? Do I behold him as just this physical human organoid, this thing that I'm looking at right now? Or is it also the things that he necessarily requires in order to do this? Or exactly how you define it is somewhat up to the eyes of the beholder a little bit. There doesn't seem to be a sufficient definition beyond that.
So we're at the I know when I see it stage of definition?
Yes, we are.
I think there's a culturally implied definition of cyborg from our wealth of science fiction resources, but those are, like Trevor has said, can be sort of muddied by trying to pin it down with like an actual formal definition. You could even consider a primitive human that has tied a stone to a stick and used it to break other stones a cyborg, because he's created some sort of extension of themselves in order to perform a task in a more efficient manner. But we wouldn't dare even probably remotely call them a cyborg in the 21st century. But if that's what it is, then perhaps that's the case. You might be able to dance around something like, if it replaces a fundamental part of your natural biology, then maybe like a prosthetic limb or a bionic eye, or if you're like General Grievous and you have an exoskeleton and very few remaining organic biological parts, maybe you could be considered a cyborg.
I'm curious where the transfer is when you go from cyborg, because now we're talking transhumanism and like really getting into it. I'm curious where the transfer is. So right now, what I feel like what we're talking about is the transfer from human to cyborg, and I'm also curious where we go from cyborg just to full artificial or android or robot, whatever you want to call it.
So general consideration might be that a cyborg was at some point a human being, whereas an android, depending on the piece of sci-fi that you're looking at, an android was whole cloth, never a human.
Well, here's the difficulty with that, though. I mean, I'm kind of ship of Theseusing this, but like, let's say theoretically, I replace you piece for piece for piece over a period of 1,000 years with artificial bits, and like, not even like we can really stretch this, like not even artificial in the sense that it's like hard steel, cold, and like it's attached to the side of your head. And like in that old sci-fi sense, or the sense that you might normally think when you think of a cyborg. I mean, more like replicants from Blade Runner, like artificial neurons,
like
artificial
organs grown in a lab.
Okay.
Well, maybe not even organs grown in a lab. They could be, because those are in a sense organic. It could also be something artificial that is just highly complex and almost interchangeable with what you could consider organic. You can kind of go in a lot of directions with this. Just anything artificially created in the lab, sure, and replacing every little aspect of who you are, one by one by one by one. Like, let's say
The
a
physical
neuron dies.
aspects, you mean?
Yeah, the physical aspects. So, for example, once you hit adulthood and neurogenesis ends, so your brain produces neurons like through in a couple specific places throughout your life, but in most places, it essentially ends once you reach adulthood. At that point, when neurogenesis ends, you start to go down. I can't remember the exact number, but I remember a lecture once where it was on the scale of about 1,000 neurons a day, and like those empty spaces get filled in with glia cells and just essentially just become vacuous, and that's why the brain seems to shrink, and the inner opening gaps in your brain, they're called ventricles, slowly grow, or at least appear to grow, due to the fact that your brain just atrophies naturally, just as a factor of existence over time. Imagine whenever, let's say we had a whole bunch of micro robots or small things that just travel around your bloodstream, go inside of your blood-brain barrier, and walk around and replace and edit dead neurons whenever they die. Whenever like a neuron goes through apoptosis, it finds that area, it fills the gap with a new neuron, like an artificial one, and then moves on. Let's say that goes on, and let's say that goes on for a period of 120 years, 150 years, until eventually every single organic neuron is now gone. Is that person, I mean, under that definition, Michael, that you had just given, that person is still necessarily a cyborg, it seems like. But at the same time, it seems almost as if we've gone into something else now. Like something new is happening. Like this is not just me and like part of my flesh is no longer flesh or the normal flesh in the normal sense. It's now I am the resultant effect of this thing. And while I can tie a line of identity between like this thing and before I was a cyborg even, it feels as if I've entered into something else. And I'm curious how you feel about this.
Yeah. So I think the ship at Theseus problem has kind of been approached in different contexts, right? So we've looked at fiction where people are uploaded completely into like some sort of um, electronic substrate, but also from like an almost completely there angle, you've got full body replacement where just like the brain remains in stuff like Ghost in the Shell, right? And I think Ghost in the Shell actually tackles this kind of ship of Theseus idea, not from a complete angle, although arguably, you do wind up eventually to the point that you're saying, with what you would have to necessarily classify as like a different thing than like a normal human. You might say they're like, circumhuman, or like some sort of like, prefixed
Post-human.
You
for
could,
the
if
book
the
points
form.
say
Yeah,
post-human.
you just brought up, yeah, Bray just mentioned it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Post-human, ex-human, was human.
But I want to tie into something here that I see that always kind of like sticks with me and like kind of bugs me a little bit whenever transhumanism is on the table, which is that there's a necessary distinction between like transhumanism in which people are voluntarily improving things about themselves, and like the second case of where people are being like contractually obligated and or like societally obligated to be modified, and then there's like the final case where it's like it is like simply like totally a cultured thing and there isn't anyone who is modified, right? And these aren't necessarily stages that flow into each other. They're just kind of like
Different
general
avenues.
outcomes.
Yeah.
And they have different like groundings as to why they might happen. But I want to tie back to what Bray was saying earlier, where it's like, oh, you just consider the person as information, as an input-output system. It's a person as a cybernetic system, basically, where you have a feedback loop, and we're considering it from a systems model. And that always kind of bothers me because, like, typically the people who are writing and getting really heavily into transhumanism are actually hyper analytical, but like in the sense that like they don't live in their own bodies. There's a lack of like embodiment. I get the vibe of it's like I hate the flesh or like I have distaste for my own body, and then that is like a psychological driver towards ideation that is like around transhumanism, and that always kind of like to me it's a very like clear your problem is not the problem you're trying to solve, but you are going in an interesting direction with your thoughts here.
You know what? I really like, this really reminds me, early in the show, we used to always say, like, I think your neuroses are showing whenever like someone would say something. And I think you're kind of touching on that here. Like people who are transhumanists are in a sense, you can kind of see their neurosis through their transhumanism, some of them, like their particular avenue. It comes from their own disgust of their own selves or their self-worth or something or rather, however you get there.
Not always, but yeah, it's
Yeah.
like a distinct it's a very easy like kind of dot to try and connect there.
That, or you can consider it from this angle as well, in that you may not be able to tell because somebody is pursuing a more authentic version of themselves and therefore using a device in order to achieve a more stable, stasis. Like somebody with ADHD might take medication in order to stabilize, the activity in their brain. Or somebody who's transgender might take gender affirming care in order to achieve a more adequate, outward appearance or internal chemical structure.
Now that I think about it, I think that I'm curious how you feel about this, but it feels a little bit as if, not talking about transgender, it feels like transgender people or the transgender movement is doing sort of the ideological groundwork for what this could be. Like it seems like they're laying down the bottom floor from which this sort of thinking can be derived. So obviously, no one's really thinking about this now. Like there's like one or two cases of Neuralink people playing chess and all that. So we see sort of the beginning mechanisms sort of at play and moving towards mind modification or whatever it is you want to say, or brain interface communication. That's increasing. But I think a lot of the biggest work happening right now is actually happening ideologically in that sense. People laying down the work of changing who your self-identity fundamentally in terms of this ground root gender thing. Like the fact that that's happening, I think, is necessarily going to be the way that we're going to see this transhumanism go. And I can't help but wonder if those two things would become cotangent. Like this kind of reminds me of reading this book recently called Destiny Disrupted. It's a fantastic historical. It's about 300 pages. It just goes through the history of the world through the eyes of Islam, like the Muslim point of view, like the view of the Ummah towards the structure of the world and where things came from, and like where like the chapters of world history are. And they're not the same as how they are in like the West. It's like there's this distinguishment there. Like, we think of things in terms of a lot of the time like the historical point of view starting in like ancient Greece and ancient Israel, and then kind of out of that you see like the growth and eventually Renaissance, and then eventually colonialism, and then eventually where we are now. Well, I've been reading this book, and why did I bring this up? There's this point of view that was brought up in there that I thought was really interesting, where they talk about how at one period during, I believe, the Umayyad Caliphate, one of the second dynasty of caliphates in Islam, and in that one, there were these two different factions that were fighting against the primary faction, the Umayyad Caliphate. One of which were the original Persians, modern-day Iranians, who were culturally, they felt, disenfranchised by the Arabization of the Muslim world, and this other group that felt that the had a political philosophy or a religious philosophy that they believed that Muhammad should be in control, or his descendants should be in control of the caliphate, like the caliph should be a descendant of Muhammad in some sense. And due to the fact that they both really disliked the Umayyad Caliphate, they kind of became kind of the same thing. And now we see like Shiites today are mostly in Iran, and has a lot to do with the intermixing of two political philosophies because the desired goals were essentially the same. A fight against the Arabization of Iran, and the other one against the specific majority Islamic faith in the Muslim world. And just like that, they coalesced just due to the fact that they had the same enemy, like the enemy of my enemy, my friend, and that sort of thing. And now we have our current situation in the world where Shiites are primarily in Iran, or Iranians are primarily Shiite, I should say, and or Shia. And why did I bring all this up? I think it's kind of connected to this whole point about the groundwork of ideology of the transgender rights movement. That could eventually become the groundwork, and the flow of ideas could eventually become what we now are talking about here, transhumanism. You can kind of see that movement there, where you see, like, if you're looking at this from like from a very general, almost meme-like point of view, the purple-haired people going into full like regalia of extension of their consciousness and brain-computer interfaces, and extending their minds beyond what is normally your prerequisite or your previous capabilities. You extending and jailbreaking your own consciousness, like that could become, there could be a flow of ideas in that direction, kind of like how art can kind of shift from this particular kind of art, like cubism, into this, like that. We could see that extension happen in the next 20 to 30 years. And I'm really curious exactly what how that will mix with the rest of political thinking in our time, in the 2030s and the 2040s, let's say. It feels as if that could be a very viable flow of information, like a very viable exchange of ideas and movement and progression of the transgender rights movement today. Just think about that. I mean, it ideologically speaking, the groundwork seems very like viable for transhumanism, very viable.
I think I can see how that would work. So to stay, or at least use the transgender area as a jumping off point, if you consider hormones, like for example, spironolactone is used to suppress testosterone in the body. And then this is for male to female hormone replacement therapy. Estradiol is used to basically as the estrogen supplement, like to provide the other hormone in opposition to testosterone. What those are, and there's other stuff available too. These are just a couple of examples. What those are basically information that is encoded in the form of whether you take it in an injection or a little pill or whatever. It's information that's been encoded in some sort of material substrate that is then ingested in the body and changes the way that your body operates. It rewrites more or less the instructions, the information that is you. And it's not too far removed, I would say, from something like the gene editing stuff that is inevitable, in my opinion.
Oh, it already exists. Or do you mean it to a different extent?
I mean, like in a more widespread application, like in the future. So for like how we've obviously we completed the human genome coding like early in the 2000s, was it? Like 04 or something? But that technology has gotten cheaper over time, to where at some point it may be the case that you could easily like sequence your entire genome at home or up the street at somewhere and get a layout of your entire being, so to speak. And you could have monthly sequencing appointments to detect cancer at like stage 0 or any other sort of things going on. And then depending on how ethical conversations work out about that, have those treated before they even arise. And that would be groundbreaking in the field of medicine. But that's not so far removed for me from ingesting things to essentially do the same thing, alter information inside of your body. That makes you more authentic. I mean, I would not be authentically me if I was dead, I would argue. So, being able to prevent terminal illnesses and diseases would be pretty important to me, just as much as something like changing my hair chemistry to represent a more authentic version of myself, or taking some sort of hormones to radically alter both my body and my mental chemistry.
Sure. I want to touch a little bit now and like break into the actual science happening today in this field. One researcher I got really into when I was preparing a topic about this for a lecture. We got into this research by this one guy, Dr. Rajesh Rao, over at the University of Washington. He's doing some ludicrous stuff. Basically, there's a lot of over at the University of Washington, over at UW. There's a large what do you call it, brain-computer interface sub-community in the neuroscience department over there, and there's a lot of research happening in that. And his particular work are on these what he calls them brain co-processors. He calls them terrifying,
right?
Immediately terrifying.
Did you share something about this?
Yeah,
recently,
I think I told you about this. Like you and I were on a phone call, and I told you about this.
Yeah.
So basically,
well, I have no idea.
Well, I'm gonna tell you and the listener. We're gonna get this message across. All right. So, so first off, when we talk about brain-computer interfaces, the goal is essentially two things. It's in two parts. One is decoding, being able to receive inputs, whether it be invasively, so from your brain, like I stick in like an actual electrode directly into your brain that is adjacent to some neurons that can pick up some signaling, or non-invasive, so like an EEG headset or something like that, or maybe like some sort of MRI scanner. They can pick up signals and gather that information. So that's step one, is decoding that information, taking that information, that data, whatever it is, however it's pronounced, however you show that data in a string of information. Being able to decode that information is step one. Being able to know what the neurons are doing and being able to represent that in some sort of efficient manner that it can be used. Something where it's simultaneous. So as soon as I get the signal, I'm able to decode it as quickly as physically possible. So basically what are the implications of that? Right now, it's in prosthetics. So somebody, for example, that's missing an arm, we have now prosthetics that hook up to like nerve clusters at the very end of the clump of their hand if they have like some nerves left from where their arm used to be, like right where their elbow used to connect or wherever else it might be. And they're able to use that a little bit for some very slow movements or some very like rudimentary stuff like that. It ranges quite a lot. But basically, the idea of right now for brain-computer interfaces is being able to decode that information being delivered, let's say, from your primary motor cortex and regions adjacent to it. So like, here's a brain right here, folks. People are watching.
Shameless self-promotion.
Shameless self-promotion. I'm not selling anything. Not yet. So like something like, like this region around here, if I remember. No. Yes. Yeah. Either way, so your brain basically decodes that information and from this region here, and then essentially can deliver that information, relay that information into a prosthetic limb of some sort. And if you do it really, really well, theoretically, it should be just as good, if not better, one day than your current ability right now. So eventually being able to have a prosthetic limb, let's say once the hardware is figured out, because it's kind of hard to get a hand that can do this, like a really good robot hand that's able to go like that and like, do that, right? But once you get the hardware right, you get a prosthetic capable of doing that. The big goal next, when it comes to brain-computer interfaces, is being able to build something that's able to decode your brain's commands to be able to do this. So that's decoding. The second step to brain-computer interfaces, is much more difficult, I think. It's encoding information. So decode it, and now you want to encode it. By encoding, I mean via whether it's in your brain or being stimulated to your brain from outside of your brain, we want to be able to encode information into your brain, be able to deliver and instruct neurons what is currently happening from some sort of exterior source. So once again, prosthetics, the idea there is I want to be able to feel this hand so I can control it even when it's behind my back. I know where it is. In space, I could feel what touches it. I have sense perception once more. And if I were to go like that, I feel something. There is something it is like to touch my thumb. I feel that sensation of thumb touching via the encoding of information from the brain-computer interface, whatever it is, whether it be Neuralink or anything else, directly back into my brain, into like the primary sensory cortex and association areas adjacent to it. So that is the essential groundwork right now happening in brain-computer interfaces. The work to decode information, which is happening all over the place, and encode information. More difficult, I think, but also in places all around the U.S., I know at least, and especially, certainly Europe too, and China. So that's where the current work is. So what are the implications of this? Well, for one, it's prosthetics. Being able to build like a robot leg, a robot arm, anything like that. But when it comes specifically to Dr. Rajesh Rao and the implications of his research, is these things called brain coprocessors, where you essentially, the idea is once you can decode and then encode information into the brain, first off, to do that, very likely you'll have to use AI of some sort that's able to decipher huge amounts of signal and decipher what your brain specifically is trying to say, because you have a very special type of fingerprint that your brain has. What you necessarily are, your brain's connections and connectome is very specific to you. Once you're able to decode that information, that's great. And once you're able to encode information, that's even greater. You now are able to create a feedback loop between something and your brain. And what is your brain if not a series of feedback loops and feed-forward circuits and neural circuits that do communication with one another in a large system? So necessarily, once you're capable of encoding and decoding information with the brain-computer interface, you're capable necessarily of extending your mind in that sense. Because at that point, if I were to do any sort of computation outside of the brain in this thing, a brain coprocessor, process something and then encode that information back in, you can kind of think of, like, if I were to do this to myself, Trevor is now no longer just this human organoid, this human organic thing. I'm not an organoid. That's a different thing. We can get into that one day. Human brain organoids, terrifying. What I am at that moment isn't just this organic Trevor. It's the organic Trevor and the brain coprocessor. Like my identity, it would be, in a sense, more useful to think of me as me and the coprocessor, not just Trevor. Like the visage, the organic thing. It's me plus this coprocessor. Because at that point, it's an extension, in a sense, of my mind. My ability to render information is edited. I am now capable of much more. And the implications of it is terrifying, because that's when we start to touch on things like the Kala, that thing we talked about at the very beginning, where we could actually use that to connect to a Starlink or some shit, I don't know, and communicate with one another electrically via this communication network. And that could be done through brain coprocessors. And all of a sudden, I could have encoded into my brain what you're giving off. So, Bray, for example, if you have extreme pain right now, you could actually, if you wanted to, theoretically, if we both were wearing brain coprocessors, we could have the settings written such that when you suffer extreme pain, there's sort of an aura around you, depending on distance. I'm making this up as I go, but let's say there's an aura of your felt sensation of pain, like almost an extension off of like your face giving off pain. Like you actually elicit pain from your brain coprocessor, and then anyone that's close enough can maybe not feel pain, maybe yes, but just understand what you're feeling right now. Like I actually, in a sense,
take 1d4 psychic damage.
Yeah, exactly. Psychic damage. That's great. But essentially, at that point, I'm able to interact with and gain a very serious degree of empathy with you, more so than I ever have before. And this research is happening right now, these brain coprocessors. It's perfectly possible. And this is just one avenue, of course. There's also Starlink that's happening right now. And many other things. There's a real explosion coming from developments in AI, along with just incredibly advanced and developing new brain neuroimaging techniques that are allowing for this sort of research to happen. And that's essentially why I wanted to talk about transhumanism this episode, because like that crazy thing I just described to you of giving off an aura of sensation, of emotion, of being able to be felt by another person, by like that could actually happen. Like that's not science fiction. Well, it is, but it's about to become so much more. And I'm worried about it because it does have implications for things like free will, as well as the free trade of information. We already know the NSA is invading everything that we are in terms of our online presence. We know that that's already happening. So you can't help but worry once we all become jacked in. Once that happens, you can't help but worry what happens to your information at that point, because all of you, a large portion of you at that point is online, or is your information is now addressable by other people in a very grand scale sort of way. It's
Yeah.
very worrisome.
I'd like to take that and shift the viewing angle a little bit. So the concerns that you're addressing are really from an individual perspective, but from a group perspective, it's the same issue as any other type of like new form of sharing information, where you are suddenly adding an entire layer on top of existing communication structures, and therefore you're also adding another layer of misinformation. You're adding another layer of the potential to uh, give out manipulative tactics in a different new way. With every sort of like communicative channel that you open up, there will be bad actors. Um, and we've seen that with the internet, and we've also seen how over the last 20, 30 years, society has kind of, as the adoption curve of people has like increased, how social dynamics have changed, and how some people have become more empathetic. Some people have had more opportunity to kind of peer inside the craniums of other individuals, but also some people have become misanthropic. People have become uh, fallen into a heyday of manipulation and scheming, and so I don't want to frame it either direction, but it has both positive and negatives to have any sort of connective interface like that, as well as like any sort of transhumanism. So like the the hell world of Deus Ex Human Revolution, where you get, biotic upgrades and you become a cyborg, but like at the cost of, well, you're indebted to this company for like 20 years worth of income. Like it's not great. Or like in Ghost in the Shell, where they work for the government, yes, and the main character is fully cyberized, as they say. So it's just her brain, the rest of it's robot, and that's owned by the government. So if she ever wanted to quit the job, how does that work?
Yeah, there you are. That kind of reminds me, connecting it back to the Star Trek thing that I brought up earlier with the Kala. It's actually in the plot of the game, where eventually a hive consciousness invades the Kala and converts the entire species of the Protoss into like a parasite. Essentially invades and completely controls all individuals. It just becomes one hive thing. It takes over. Gone. Every individual is now lost.
That reminds me of the concept of, and it showed up multiple times in the books that I've been reading recently. The concept of information wants to be free, and it's the idea that basically that information has continuously gotten cheaper over time, and like trends towards just wanting to be like completely accessible to everyone, free of charge, like like for Wikipedia or something like that, or different sorts of services online. That's a whole nother thing, but basically the idea that information doesn't want to be expensive, it wants to be free. Not that it's an acting agent, but it trends that way. And I think the only way that you can ensure that something like that happens, alongside other goods and services, also another conversation, but the only way you can ensure that that happens, and I think it's beneficial that information be free for everybody, in the sense that we aren't at the behest of some corporation that's going to keep us on the limb for decades, if that's even possible in the future. Or they'll take our children. They'll take our children's money.
Well, not that, but they already definitely do hold you on the limb for decades.
Right. Again,
Houses,
the future is
cars.
already here, just not evenly distributed. But the only way to ensure that is that people oppose a structure in which mega corporations own information and then dole it out per contractual obligations from a consumer, or any number of different mediums, a subscription service, etc. The information economy is going to be the new economy. It's all information now. Matter of fact, I'm glad that I
been the
kind of
new
circled
economy.
back. Oh, yeah. Like, there
That's
were
20
some great
years.
examples in here about how things have been changed into basically informational patterns, like money. We are gradually moving away from physical money towards digital currency. There was a great, there's a great. I don't remember if it was a Subway take or it was a stand-up joke or something. I think it was a Subway take. It's a little social media account where this guy like asks people on the subway what their hot take is or whatever. And one guy was like, rich people are really lucky that money doesn't exist anymore. Like in a physical sense, like you can't just go to somebody's house and they have like a giant safe and it's got like gold in it or something. Like it's all offshore, digitally stored, and some, it's like, oh, they're really lucky we can't just all rush in there with pitchforks and torches. Anyway, that aside, money is an example. Even surrogacy is mentioned in this book about, in vitro fertilization, things like access to computer networks rather than physical possession of data. That's books, video, audio, all of this stuff. Even dating people, like, has been completely usurped by. You can see polls of people who are like, "How do you meet partners now?" And it's like overwhelmingly through online services as opposed to meeting in some sort of physical conception. And I think that trend's just going to continue to diversify itself across fields. Like one of the books I read months ago was a book about communicating. It was written from the perspective of people in the future to people in the past about how robots had taken over a bunch of different things. And it was like, even medicine will eventually become an information economy where it's no longer about having doctors and nurses and all of these people who train for years and understanding this material. It'll be about more tangentially people who can supervise robots or some sort of system that will do all of that itself, because it already knows how to do all of that. They may act in a more consultant position than an actual, like, I know everything about this topic and I know how to perform this surgery and here's what you need. The robot will diagnose you faster. The robot will know exactly what to prescribe you. The robot will be able to do the surgery far safer than a human being. The robot, you get my point. It's all going to become information, and it could be, say, Amazon Pharmaceuticals or Amazon Surgical that owns the robots and the models and everything that knows how to do all of this stuff. They own all of the information. And then you're paying Amazon for your open heart surgery, or you're paying Apple for your such and such implantation or brain. You get my point.
Right. We discussed this before, a couple episodes ago about universal basic income and this idea that as everything becomes artificial, you start to devalue the amount of money that gets put into something like getting an important heart surgery, let's say, due to the fact that like there was no one else in the room that committed to the surgery. Like nobody else did it. It was just like something that was done to you, and no one else was even aware that it was happening. It was just something that you did, and it was taken care of by this artificial intelligence and various tiny little metal arms. And this idea of like, well, why am I, and then I pay this person for it, that so on and so forth. It kind of devalues the entire thing.
Couldn't even know like a lick of anything about medicine or surgery or health. They just own a device that has learned everything there is to know about modern medicine and how to perform a surgery to like 99.999% success rate, and you pay them instead.
You talked about surrogacy for a second there, and I think that that's also really interesting. Michael, you went to one place talking about like the way that culture will engage with and encounter this transhumanism thing, and the various ways that that can develop, and how it can become sort of, in some sense, in some avenues, it could be considered to be culturally impulsive, or like the design of the culture is such that everybody becomes transhuman as a matter of course. It's just something that people do, and that's just the way that everything goes, and like that's the way that we all do things now. And that's one possible avenue. And the reason why I bring this up is this idea of surrogacy, and I suddenly got pictured into my mind that really silly Superman movie with Henry Cavill, the one that
Man
like
of
the
Steel.
yeah, Man of Steel. Because in that one, like the plot was like the Kryptonians are all born in like sacks, like
Like the Matrix.
yeah, exactly. Like they're
Mm-hmm.
produced in essentially a place from a gene seed, and it
Human
creates
beings are no longer born.
yeah,
They're
yeah.
grown.
Yeah, I'm kind of connecting that with the idea from like the Borg from Star Trek, because in those, well, they harvest humans. They don't create humans, which I think is really stupid. That's a part of Star Trek I never understood. Just make more. But
Get
If you stick them
wrecked,
in a room
boy.
together, you'd be surprised.
yeah, you'd be surprised what they're capable of. Yeah, no, but like in the show, like the Borg have to like go around harvesting biomass. You can't just make more of them, which is just really stupid. And the one thing that they do though in the Borg is like when people are born, they're put into a maturation chamber where they are converted, like their biomass, and they're turned into cyborgs, and all of the parts that are irrelevant are removed, all the parts that are necessary are added to such an extent that eventually a Borg leaves the chamber complete. And that's, I can't help but wonder if you make it a culturally uh, important thing where you necessarily have to become a cyborg. Like that's just what everyone does. Eventually, everyone gets the Neuralink. It's just something that humans do in the progression of things. In the same sense that all of us have an iPhone today.
Vaccines.
Or
Well,
yeah,
that's
sure.
even more like
That's even better.
in
It's
a
even better
sense, but it's
example.
like even
Circumcision.
like try
Yeah,
getting a
there you go.
job without maybe a cell phone or an internet connection. Not having access to the internet in the 21st century. See you later, peasant. See you later, caveman.
Yeah, and
It's
connecting.
just there's certain
I would say the
avenues.
Amish live considerably better than cavemen did.
Say what?
The Amish are doing all right.
Yeah, the Amish
Well,
are
they've got
doing
their own
good.
little like Amish pocket dimension, where they,
They're doing good. They're enjoying
They
themselves.
cultivated that shit. Hey.
Yeah, they have a society to themselves, and a lot of people find them quite admirable. But speaking specifically of this, though, you can't help but wonder if it'll eventually lend itself where this idea, like culturally speaking, everyone should get the chip or whatever. It'll eventually lend itself to, okay, well, when do you get the chip? When do you become dependent upon it? And then eventually, as that grows and grows and grows and time goes on, I'm talking on a very, very large scale in
He
terms
said
of centuries.
300 years.
Yeah, 300, 400, 40,000 years. Like if you want to do that, I can't help but imagine at some point this idea that you actually do it in utero or something very early, where you start creating humanity where you're necessarily one with this thing. It's not from, there's no bar mitzvah for receiving your Neuralink. It's just something
From the
that
moment
happens.
I was a zygote, the
Yeah,
nanomachines began integrating themselves into the very
Yeah.
structure of my growth.
Yeah.
Well, when you think about it, Trevor, it's kind of like earlier when I was talking about watching people go through the transition between using a dumb phone, quote unquote, to a smartphone. It's like after a while, when people continue to relay to you the ease and comfort of using a smartphone, and like, consider an older person today sitting with, their family, and they're like trying to decide on a place to go and eat dinner. It's like, well, the older person might be like, well, or let's put it this way: an older person and they're in a different city that they've never been to, because at that point, an older person would know most of the restaurants in the place that they live. But in a new environment, for example, an older person might want to go ask somebody on the street, or find a guide, or like a tour, or an information center, or some more physically grounded form of information. Whereas the younger people will say, "Ah, nope, got it. Here it is. I'm currently looking up places online," and it may be the case that one of the fucking Gen Alpha Skibbity Riz Ohio kids is like, "Yo, Chat GPT, what's the hottest place around to eat?" And it's like, bam, instantly like provides a list of places to eat that are the best. And it's exposure to things like that over a long period of time that I think people go, damn, maybe I need to get with the times and get the fucking Neuralink and be instantly gratified with any whim or desire that I have, like everybody else. Why am I suffering in the information era when such a thing is available?
Yeah, and what's funny about that is all the while that happens, I am certain if there is such an avenue as that, I am certain there's also at the same time going to be an undercurrent of people who absolutely refuse to ever be involved with Neuralink or anything like it. You know, like an undercurrent of this and also that, kind of like with the ancient, with the Umayyads that existed in that period. Going back to that book I mentioned, at the same time, there's also always going to be undercurrents of this idea and that idea and this idea, the antithesis thereof of particular philosophies that currently exist today. You're going to have many different ideologies all existing at once, and you could definitely see an anti computer interface ideological point of view grow in juxtaposition to the BCI, the brain computer interface ideology. You know, I think you could see like they might grow as two distinct fundamental units at the same time as this begins to pick up. Like you're going to have people that find a certain amount of revulsion towards it, and even and you could even have a quasi-religious component to both ends as well. The whole thing gets really quite complex and interesting as time goes by, because you could see people also say like the transcendentalists in the term of like nature, like you can't possibly get this thing. You need to conform with and touch with ancient with your DNA and the earth and the universe that you are derived from, and you need to find the rhythm of the universe and release yourself from this artificial want to conflate and feed back your dopamine back into yourself, this very opulent and strange thing that you're getting into. And then the other half of it could be, well, we're approaching a new state of consciousness. A transcendentalist in the other sense, someone who thinks that by coalescing all of our minds together into a hive consciousness, we are going exactly where we need to go. This is the progression of where intelligence goes. This is where life goes, and we are reaching the next step of human evolution. You could see religious components, spiritual components of both ends. You could see many different channels of ideas all interacting and engaging, sometimes violently, with this over the next as it develops. Very curious how it's going to go. Very curious.
So
it's go ahead, Michael.
My predominant concern with all of this is how the majority are affected. So like, as you said, the older people are the late adopters, and some of them are finally like getting to the point of pulling out their phones and checking for restaurants maybe, but or just minimally using Facebook and some other things,
right?
Just barely engaging with it. But what I really want to highlight is like the increasing cognitive complexity of everyday life over the last 20 to 30 years, and how it is not something that everybody can keep up with. And I've definitely seen sentiments that like basically subsequent layerings of cognitive complexity are actually outpacing people in different like parts of the bell curve, as far as like how they deal with it, and then what it does to their like general everyday affect, as far as like when you are cognitively overloaded for so long, you basically kind of like zombie out, and you stop being able to connect with reality in the same way. And so you just start scrolling all the time. This is one of the symptoms that this pet theorist was kind of pointing at. So there's sort of a, I wouldn't say it's a conservative minded concern, but there is a concern of like, well, okay, what kind of dynamic organic structures are going to come out of this to accommodate the fact that like you're basically uprooting human interaction, but also like driving people to have to use their heads way more than like they may be capable of per day, and therefore they do a lot of shortcutting. And if the system is sufficiently complex, then that shortcutting can actually really screw them.
Or they become deficient in areas fundamentally. Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, I'm kind of reminded of like where I live in California. I see this very often. I work in research, and I go in and I meet people that are extremely, extremely intelligent, much more than I am. People that come in and just say incredible things, and I think I understand, and they get into this whole idea, and they do like a lecture of some sort. I see those, and then after I finish watching this lecture, this seminar, or something or rather, I'll then walk home, and on my walk home, there is a park, and that park has about 30 tents inside of it. It's just that's the walk home, and that's what I see in California. It's this strange hot and cold. It's people who have adapted to the system, and to such an extent that they have hyper fixated on something and become uh, highly organized and highly efficient, and can engage with the system at a hyper complex level, because the system itself is hyper complex and allows for people like that to exist and engage with it, create this feedback loop between themselves and the system, and do extremely complex and incredible things. But at the same time, the system is so complex that a lot of people are quite literally destroyed by it. Like there are people who see like this huge cornucopia of dopamine and drugs and sex and money and this, that, and the other thing, and pornography and all that. Next thing you know, they're just a dopamine highway, and they just don't know how to engage with it. And they eventually find themselves alienated by it, and they find themselves living somewhere where you and I would prefer not to live, or how.
You best start believing in cyberpunk dystopias. You're in one. It's like the homeless person on the side of the street with the Oculus Quest on.
Are you serious? Is that something you saw, or you just like?
There's a photo that's like, I don't know, like semi-viral, of like somebody who like looks like they may be homeless, just out on the side of the street, sitting down against a wall, like with the Oculus Quest.
Yeah, it's a cyber dystopia. Yeah, yeah.
But
nice.
Yeah, and I don't particularly, I don't blame our unhoused people, or whatever term you want to use, for more likely than not being abandoned by the system in which they live. Because, and that's what I mean by it's the responsibility of people to stand up to business interests that drive all of these changes in society, that don't do anything to sort of, or at least refuse to participate in a structure that would alleviate many of those problems. Like, I mean, I would hesitate to say that if you walked up to the 400 wealthiest people in the country, or even just like Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, what's his name, the following richest people who own mega corporations, or just numerous corporations, and said, hey, we're going to tax you at like a fucking ridiculous amount. Sorry, we got to fix problems in the country. Like, they wouldn't be like, okay, sounds good. That's a great idea. We should do that.
Fund this super PAC now.
Yeah, these people historically oppose this sort of stuff, and I think that's because people, more or less, it's a very convoluted conversation, let them. And I think if people continue to allow that to happen, then we will only see more disparity as this goes on, and that's how we end up in situations like this in relation to transhumanism. Is that if people do nothing to oppose the foundations of progress, which are these corporations, or that may partner with academic institutions and government funding for things like this, and all of this, and we continue to progress exponentially, mind you, throughout the 21st century, and don't even address important things like people's basic survival needs. Like, we can't even guarantee people here it is right here, everybody, go required reading. This is the second Bill of Rights that never happened. If we don't
what is it called?
It's literally the second Bill of Rights.
I can't. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I know. I hate this, but Franklin Roosevelt's never seen to fruition second Bill of Rights that guaranteed, people education and a job and a home and all of these things. If we can't even address these basic needs, how can we even talk as a society about reaching a point in which we are transhuman or post-human. It's like we can't even be human at this point. Like I'm not get, you know, I mean, you know, my position as far as the role of the government, which is to ensure the well-being of its citizens. But if I can't be ensured regular access to food, like healthy food, clean drinking water, a home, a job, preferably in line with American values like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, meaning I don't need to work something that doesn't provide me, you know, that I don't feel gratitude or joy or a sense of meaning and purpose through doing. It's like, what are we really doing? Like, are we dropping out into this sort of limbo of eternal or rather perpetual bliss through technology, like you were saying earlier, Trevor, like just this dopamine feedback loop or something like that, and just dropping out of society and existing in a park with dozens of other people because all we have is high tech but low life. I don't know. Let me drop out of my rant.
Well, you know,
I feel like a lot of people are already doing that, but they're just not in a park.
Right. I mean, we haven't reached critical mass yet, but I hesitate to say that, you know, the way
what does
that
critical mass look like?
Yeah,
is that population decline? Is that people not being able to interact with each other in casual conversation? What does that look like?
That's already happening in a...
Listen, no, this is you remember,
it's like you're saying it's not already here when it very clearly is to me.
No, I'm all on board with it. It's already here. And that's why I have so much. That's why, for example, cyberpunk is probably my most, like, that's my hyperfixation right now, because every time I turn around, I see something new that I'm like, holy fucking shit, you've got to be kidding me. Like, we are living in the times, just without all of this extra window dressing, you know, that comes with the genre. But yeah.
you know, Bray, you walk in a direction of solving these problems. The way you engage with these problems. So let me restart. I think you and I are very on key, or we're very together whenever it comes to addressing these issues. And I think we're like encountering these issues and defining what they are. Like, I think you and I are on the same scale or the same wavelength whenever we think about these issues and we address them and call them what they are: issues and problems that need to be solved. I think we're on the same wavelength there. But I think one huge distinction that I feel about this is is what we want to do about it, the way that we engage with it. So it seems to me, Bray, that whenever you see this issue, you and I call a spade a spade. And then after it's called a spade, it seems that from that point, your point of view is often towards government and the idea of like, we need, or community or collectivity. Like the collective now needs to wire a solution to this problem in order that we may continue. And then from there you then to and then from there you scaffold some sort of way of thinking about this in terms of and from the point of view of how the collective can deal with this problem. But I'm very different. I don't feel that that's a good idea. I very often think not because I very much so encounter it instead as an individual. It's something that the person listening to this needs to think of and encounter on their individual basis and try to figure out or encounter it from their individuality and how they as a person will become who they are through this information and how to encounter it there and then as a person. I'm very individual about it. There are reasons for that. I think the biggest one is I'm very scared of governments generally. I find that they usually, I think naturally speaking, every civilization, everywhere you go, there's going to be a percentage of humans that are interested in power and in control and that sort of thing. And government is just the thing that exists so those people can have their fun before they die. It's just something that exists that's out there. Like, for example, like that book I've been reading, Destiny Disrupted. It's really interesting that Muhammad creates this Ummah, this like House of Islam, this community from this perspective, this book. I highly suggest this book. It's very interesting. As someone who's very not a Muslim, I find it very interesting how it gets started, but also their point of view. It's very inspirational. Like, it's actually very, very, very beautiful from their point of view. If you get into this literature and get into this mythos and the archetypes of the first caliphs, so like the 4 rightly guided caliphs at the very beginning, very important. But basically, after Muhammad leaves, and like after the 4 rightly guided caliphs, who, in my opinion, weren't all that rightly guided, especially towards the end, they were. It was a shitty situation. I wouldn't say that they weren't trying their best. I'm being honest. Like the last 2 especially, like they really tried. It's just it didn't quite interact in a way that you might consider to be according to the initial tenets. It didn't work out the way that they intended, and I think most people, most like Islamic historians, would probably agree to some extent. But what's interesting about that is then you have the creation of these dynasties, the Umayyads and the Abbasids and all that kind of thing. The people afterwards that come in and instantiate something. Basically, the people out there that are looking for power can then use this system to express their want and need for power. Like, there seems to always be something available in civilization for those people to exist. There needs to be a place for them to exist, and that space is government. It's just that's the place. So when I think of, well, government is the solution to my problems, I think of, no, government's the place where those power-hungry people go. And that's why the People's Republic of North Korea is a terrible place to live. Wherever it is you go, if you give the keys to the people, it doesn't matter what cloak they wear. Joseph Stalin could wear a button-up cloak that makes him look like just a normal worker. His garb doesn't change. Xi Jinping, he doesn't change. He can wear his garb, but he's still fundamentally a person seeking and attempting to influence the world via power. There's nothing more tyrannical in the last century than the tyrants who say they speak for workers. So government to me is a ground that I don't like to tread on. So when we talk about these issues of transhumanism and all that sort of thing, I wanted to just lay that out specifically for the viewer, that it doesn't necessarily have to be through government, or maybe it does, just to show you those 2 different avenues there. Like, Michael,
Sure.
Specifically, I'm interested, Michael, in how you feel about this. Like, how exactly should it be regarded? Like, because I'm coming from it from the individual, and Bray comes about it from the collective. Not 100% either one of us, but more or less, that's a good way of engaging with us. And from that perspective, I'm curious how you feel.
So my typical complaint in any sort of theoretical framework is that there's too much theory, not enough praxis. So while I appreciate the idea that like a governing body should do things, you have to incentivize people. So historically, the way that people incentivized governments to do things was typically at sword point, gun point, pick one, fist point, if needs be.
All right.
And so I actually agree with you, Trevor, in that like governments fundamentally are apparati for oligarchs and people who are good at manipulating and accumulating power to kind of further coalesce that power, as well as like right now we are in I mean, Francis Fukuyama may have reneged on his own words, but neoliberalism did establish an incredibly like statuesque and like rigid structure that has sustained itself. Now you can point at like fault tolerances in that structure and maybe where things are creaking or whatever, but fundamentally, the only thing that will drive change is when the layer that is common communication and civility breaks down. That's why the civil rights movement had such success in the 60s. It's not because of people. It is in part because of people like MLK, but the driving force was the very real, very physical threat of people like Malcolm X and the other groups that were doing real actual effort at
It's an interesting
Based.
lens to go in. It's
you
interesting to
needed
note.
both. You
Yeah.
needed both because what happens is
Yes.
the Malcolm X types drive the people in charge who have enough power to basically, like, I mean, they could have done certain things, but they would have been ideologically un-American, and at the time, it would have been very suspicious on whether or not that would have gone well with the rest of the country. And we still weren't in we still weren't in a ideologically. I would say that the governing body apparatus right now is actually more atheistic than it was 60 years ago. And so even fewer of the ruling class really care about upholding any sort of inviolable principles as long as they get theirs.
Yes.
So
yeah.
You're definitely walking in the direction I'm thinking, because it seems that oligarchs are naturally formed as a consequence of existing in space for a degree of time with stability. If there is stability,
Yes. So
yeah.
that's my
Yeah.
fundamental critique
Yeah.
towards any sort of like anarchist doctrine is like, yes, anarchism is what happens when you have a bunch of monkeys in a little space and then they have nothing else but themselves. But then over time, power is going to accrete because there are either
Insofar as there is stability, because that's important too. I think,
yeah.
for example, like the Umayyad
And power may
Caliphate,
accrete because of a lack of stability. So a lack of stability may drive individuals to become extremely frustrated and have nothing else to go for except for to establish stability by their own means.
Sure. I mean, that's a good way of saying it. I like, for example, the Umayyad dynasty, and then later the Abbasids did it way more than the Umayyads did. Created this level of opulence and power and prestige and scholarship. It quite literally the golden age of Islam during the Abbasid Caliphate. I mean, like literally, it was the best place to live in the world at that time. Like, there's no better place. It was just an incredible place of scholarship and works in mathematics and astronomy. Most stars don't have names, but those which do have names, of those, most of them have Arabic names.
You're right.
There you are. It's fascinating that so that whole civilization is created. And where am I connecting this to? I mean to say that stability allows for the creation of these high oligarchs. Because like for example, if you go into the actual history, Muhammad and the initial original followers lived very modestly. In fact, that's a huge motif in this book I'm reading, because it's this idea that a lot of people call back to the original modesty of the original followers. They were very modest initial political, or not political, but religious, eventually political point of view, where they would live very modestly and live and abide by God, perfect and total submission. And then eventually, when you allow for the extreme stability, the Pax Islam, or whatever it is you want to call it, the Islamic peace that swept over the middle world, the Middle East, from that extreme stability necessarily led to the oligarchic hierarchy that you have in the Umayyads that only increased with the Abbasids. Really interesting. And the reason why I bring all of this up is to say that it seems that it's like collectivization naturally lends credence to the collectivization. Sorry, the creation of these systems of government is basically a place where these people can behave on their scale, and that's why I usually don't engage with these things from the point of view that government will fix it. It's just that's not perfectly what the purpose of government is, and you have to let in through the back door some of this stuff as well. We could talk about solving problems. Don't get me wrong; I'm not 100% like a libertarian type. But
so it's actually an incredible apparatus for the movement of resources. It's
yes,
just you have to provide proper incentives for the people at the helm to actually do that.
Yes.
But I do want to tie the conversation back into transhumanism.
We probably should,
since that is the topic at hand, and not
the tangent there was that, you know, for a sufficiently or rather an appropriate era of transhumanism where people are actually becoming, or I'll put it this way, in a moral era of transhumanism where people are changing but for the better, there are a sufficient number of things I think need to be met prior, and currently I don't think that they're being met adequately. Like, for example, I don't like, we talked about power structure. I think whenever you have a government or any system of a nation of operation, like operation of a nation, there's going to be like power is a pie, and you have to cut the pie up somehow. There can't be nobody with power, otherwise you just total. There is no nation at that point. There is no, you know, but it's how you cut that pie up that determines how everything's going to operate. And right now in the United States, it appears as though we, are almost even entering in sort of this oligarchy where we have this last election was a great example of that, where we have people who are raising unbelievable amounts of money to run for president, where now billionaires have been appointed for cabinet positions in the upcoming administration, where millions and millions of people across the country are all connected through one singular or like a handful of different devices that are all owned by one or two particular organizations. It would be as though in our transhumanist scenario, everybody has Neuralink, and Neuralink's all owned by this one company, and now one company owns the technology and everybody's head. It's like, that's a scary thought. And I've seen people like on Reddit and say, I would never get a brain implant unless it was like open source, where it was my own copy, my own personal copy. Nobody had any sort of control or trademark or right over my own proprietary brain technology except me, and I'm the only person that can go in there and edit it or communicate with other devices unless I want it to. And that, I think, is the true way. That's the most free way for somebody to do something like that. Ideally, if I had a cell phone, I would love it to be disconnected from all of these other things, but we create these sort of avenues where we are beholden to certain things, just like I think we mentioned in a previous conversation, like iMessage or any number of things that come with Apple infrastructure. There's this sort of maybe meme about being a green text user in text messages. It's like, oh, you have green text indicating that you don't have iMessage.
You're poor?
It's like,
yeah,
you're lame. Like,
yeah.
Okay, but it's that sort of stuff more widely that also shift people towards these things. And I think power dispersed among many people rather than concentrated in the top 1% of people is preferable when we look towards the future.
Oh, well, I 100% agree. I think my worry is if we talk about like using the state to get what we want, we're necessarily allowing the oligarchs to get into our piece of the pie a little bit. I think our spirit is honestly the same.
It's those people I think need to be held at gunpoint, not the government.
No, my point is that is the government. You're necessarily
yes,
no,
exactly.
No. This is what I mean. The perfect government you're envisioning that doesn't have the men doesn't exist. Like if you go off and try to create a government that handles these problems,
well, that's what
you're creating a bludgeon that these oligarchs will use against you.
You can't allow. This is the problem: is that we've allowed this sort of thing to already happen. Like the fact that all of the money in the previous elections that has been allowed to be spent.
Yes.
The fact that I watched a video the other day of Nancy Pelosi. Somebody I think asked,
free enterprise.
It was this is a free market. I'll keep my stocks. It's like, no, you are a public servant. That doesn't mean you get to be glamorous and make all of this money and do all this. Honestly, if it was up to me, like I would probably even do a test run where like if you become the fucking president or a public servant or like the idea of a governor's mansion, many places across the United States, these people, I'm like, that kind of disgusts me. I'm like,
I will say, I think I'm very pro doing everything you can to get the oligarchs out of government. I just mean to say that you're not going to get the oligarchs out of government. You can do what you can to decrease the amount of influence they have in the system all the time. You should do that wherever you can. I think getting rid of insider trading via what they're doing, what Nancy Pelosi is doing, is a great idea. I think that would do a lot of good. But at the same time, I'm not going to lie to you and say that in 50 years' time, after that law gets passed, we're not going to have oligarchs anymore. I think that the people that are hyper fixated on power and money will naturally levitate towards getting positions in government offices and naturally find ourselves in the position that we are now. It seems that that's how human collectives organize. It really seems that way. You see it quite literally throughout all of human history. So I'm usually very afraid of giving a collective, the government, the ability or the credence that they can solve my problems, because necessarily what you're saying in a sense is oligarchs can solve my problems, or I need something which necessarily has oligarchs to solve my problems. But I'm trying to say that you can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't have a government that fixes your problems that isn't
Oh, I'll
also
get that
full of
cake.
oligarchs.
Anyways, transhumanism in this aspect. I mean, and it is tied to a lot of things. It's just like all of the, a lot of the books I've been reading are very future minded about the direction of government and the economic organization. And obviously, I am a collectivist. I'm very much a leftist in this avenue, and so I look at sort of how technology is going to uproot our lives and dramatically change things, and I look at the current economic system that we have, and I think this is not going to cut it. Like, this is not going to be adequate.
Sure.
And so that's what drives me to that sort of avenue. But I guess probably time for some closing remarks
Yes,
here.
we should. Yeah.
Somebody else go first so I can think.
Fair enough. All right.
Yeah.
Michael.
What was the topic again?
Is our fate
transhumanism,
transhumanism?
Is it our
Yeah.
fate?
And what are the
see if you can answer the
economic
question.
and governmental implications?
Yes.
Well, I think the long-termist answer is yes. Transhumanism is the fate that we are directed towards. I don't think that right now anybody has even a 5-year grasp of where that's going to go. There are plenty of directions that we have written about in sci-fi and have projected out from very early research, but frankly, it's all made up at this point, except for like a handful of prosthetics or vaccines or things that are in that fuzzy space where it's like some people would say that's not even transhumanism. You're just being silly. You're overqualifying things. You're underqualifying things. But yeah, so how that plays into politics and the life of the everyman is supremely important, and in fact, I would argue is the biggest component of the question that should be answered or even worried about. Everything else, the execution of how transhumanism affects us, the ways in which we use it in our lives, those are, in my opinion, simply components of the bigger question of what does this do for humanity as a whole organism, and for individuals operating within that. Yeah, that's
very good. Well, thank you, Michael. And I have to say, I have to agree with your final point there about yes. I think yes, humanity's fate is transhumanism. I think the one thing that's been made clear from just human history is that we don't want to die, and I think every day we do whatever we can to increase the human lifespan. You have an issue with your kidney, let's go ahead and let's get that fixed. You have this there, you have this there, and we do what we can to expand the human lifespan wherever it's potentially possible. And I don't, unless something very seriously alters human psyche and the way that we encounter reality, it seems that we're going to be carrying that with us for the foreseeable future, for the long term. And in the short term, we're having huge expansions in what we're capable of in a technological point of view. So it does seem that for as long as we fear death, we will go towards these sorts of avenues, and we will extend our lives again and again and again and again until one day we become imperishable, or at the very least on a scale of length and longevity that you and I would consider functionally imperishable compared to what we are now. So yeah, I do think it's necessarily our fate if we exist long enough. If we don't destroy ourselves from some other reason, I think we'll naturally go that direction. We either will Fermi paradox ourselves, or a solution to the Fermi paradox, we destroy ourselves, or we or we do in fact extend ourselves and become more than what we currently are. We're going to have to jailbreak the iPhone, so to say, eventually. Bray, curious how you feel.
Sure. Is our fate transhumanism? Even if I can't provide a clear answer right now, I think it's evident that we trend towards yes. We're eventually going to end up that way. And like Michael said, the important thing to take away from the conversation is what sort of political and social ramifications are going to be present because of that. Who's going to get the upgrade? Who's going to be left behind? You know, if you consider things like, even like Trevor said, like, oh, I need a kidney transplant, or I need an artificial kidney, or I need a biotechnical grown in a lab organ that's going to raise questions about the ship of Theseus within my body, and I'm going to be transhuman or whatever. If you consider things like that, well, who's going to be able to get those things? Who's going to be able to afford to get those things? Who's going to be left behind? And I think that's where a lot of the political and social implications come from in a discussion about transhumanism, and why it's so important to think about what you do, like Trevor said, as an individual in response to these things, and then from my perspective, what you're going to do with the collective to oppose things that would negatively impact your well-being as well as the society that you participate in. So yeah, you know, are we going to transhumanism? It certainly looks like it, and I think if we can live longer lives because of that, and be healthier beings, and you know, be happier, be more authentically ourselves, if we want to go that route, I think that's fantastic. I mean, that's what we're all trying to do anyway. But again, we've got to do it the right way. So.
Very good. Well, with that, listener, thank you so much for listening in, watching in, however it is you got this information.
Thanks for watching in.
Thanks for watching in. And if you do have any thoughts about this particular topic, do you think our fate is transhumanism? Do you disagree? Especially if you disagree, please put your comments down in the comments down below. Comment section. I think Spotify has something like that. I don't think so, actually.
I think so, yeah.
Do they? All right, we'll do it there. And if you can't find it, then go over to YouTube and do it there instead. Either way, have a wonderful rest of your morning, rest of your day, and we'll see you next week.
Peace. Bye.